Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started on the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject, but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or the other. I have a really open mind when it comes to disasters I'm willing to cover. The other day, I was asked if I would cover the George Floyd protests, and I said yes. So I'm going to be doing that sometime in the future. It's going to take a little bit. There's a lot of information there, but that's the kind of thing that I am willing to cover. Obviously, we have cats that is still on the list. So there's a lot of things that I am willing to cover as a disaster. The subject from this particular episode was requested by Eric, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation. Now, if you'd still like to help the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, wherever that you might listen to us on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description, wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode and the previous episode include Atlantic's Last Stop, Courage, Folly, and Lies in the White Star Line's Worst Disaster Before Titanic by Bob Chaulk. Chaulk is also featured in The Terrifying Wreck of the SS Atlantic, an excellent documentary on the sinking, which you can find on YouTube. Basically, Chaulk is your expert on the SS Atlantic. Other sources include a YouTube video of a visit to the SS Atlantic Heritage Park Interpretation Center, another video showing a real-time version of the sinking within reason, which you'll understand since that's what we're getting into today, and the website for the Heritage Center itself. So there is a lot of information that is in a couple of places that are just absolutely perfect for telling the story of the Atlantic. Now, we already told the first half of the story in part 1. Now it's time to do part 2. Episode 245, The Sinking of the SS Atlantic, Part 2, April 2nd, 1873. At least 535 deceased, hundreds injured. So, when last we left the SS Atlantic, it was under the command of Second Officer Henry Ismay Metcalf. It's the middle of the night, about 2:30, 3 o'clock. We have Captain James Williams, who is taking a little bit of a nap before they arrive at Halifax to refuel and add more coal into their coal bunkers so that they can make it all the way to Jersey City. They don't know that they already have enough coal to do that, but that's beside the point. Captain Williams had spent a little bit of time at the end of the night speaking with a writer, a reporter who wanted to ask about their diversion to Halifax and why they were doing it, had a lot of questions, got done about midnight, and about that time he was able to put everybody into their positions, tell them that he was going to be taking a nap, and tell his valet that he wanted him to come wake him at 2:40 a.m. with a cup of hot chocolate. And then if that didn't work, or if he fell asleep again, then somebody would be sent by Second Officer Metcalf to wake him up. This is where we're at. The Atlantic is pointed toward the southern shore of Nova Scotia, and it thinks that it is, or at least the crew thinks that they are headed directly for Halifax. However, the current along that southern shoreline being what it is, the Atlantic is actually drifted about 10 to 12 miles to the west. So it is not at this point pointed toward Halifax. It is pointed toward an island called called Mars Island. It's spelled Meagher's Island, Meaghers. I've seen that it's pronounced Mars Island, or that it's actually called Mars Island. The fact is, it's Mars Island, and it is it's not a big island, but it is a kind of a flat, rocky kind of island. There's only one family living on it, and that is the kind of population density that we're talking about in the area. Now that I've got all of that covered, let's move on to the actual events of that night. Now, with Captain Williams hitting the sack, Second Officer Metcalf was in charge. Williams also left, like I said, he left him with two commands. Put out a lookout who could scan the waters for ice, and keep an eye out for the Sambro Island lighthouse off to the ship's left. There were already a bunch of other lookouts sprinkled around the decks of the Atlantic, so one more wouldn't hurt. When Metcalf saw the lighthouse, he was meant to go and get Captain Williams if he wasn't already awake again and back on the bridge. Given the difficulty navigating into Halifax Harbor, Captain Williams would need to take command and use the services of a harbor pilot to get safely into port. If you remember the Halifax explosion episode, there was also a harbor pilot available in that episode to help escort the ship in question, or the ships in question, into and out of the harbor. Now, there's something you need to keep in mind about the setup on the Atlantic. When I mentioned the bridge of the ship, I imagine you pictured something like the bridge from the movie Titanic, enclosed with a clear line of sight and protection from the elements. All you can see right in front of you is that bow. You can see over everything. There's nothing obstructing your view. The bridge of the Atlantic was not like that. A little building with the chart room and wheelhouse was on top of a large deck house on the deck, and forward and above that was the bridge, open to the cold and rain and snow. So you have to think of, if you're thinking of the movie Titanic, that raised walkway that you see at the rear of Titanic in the movie, that is kind of what counts as the bridge on the Atlantic. It's right in front of the wheelhouse and the chart room. You have this raised area right there. The quartermaster would be in the wheelhouse, and he wouldn't be able to see past the obstacles in front of the wheelhouse to steer, so the officers on the bridge would contact the quartermaster through a speaking tube and tell him where to turn. So now there are officers and other crew members scattered around the deck of the Atlantic. There's officers on the bridge, quartermasters in two different wheelhouses, the one that is right behind the bridge, and then there's one farther aft, that there is a quartermaster in. Lookouts from one end of the ship to the other. Crew members cleaning the deck as preparation for the arrival in Halifax. There's just a lot of people on the bridge, on the deck, who are working on the Atlantic. Captain Williams, meanwhile, was asleep on a cot in the chart room. Now, I've seen references to him being in his own quarters. I've seen references to him being in the chart room. The chart room, I believe, comes from Atlantic's last stop, and that is, I would take as the Bible in regards to what happened on the Atlantic. He pops his head up at about 2 a.m., takes a quick peek around, kind of looks around. Everything's okay, right? Everything's kosher. And then goes right back to sleep for what he expects to be another 40 minutes or so. You know how it is. You wake up, you check your alarm. You're like, I have 20 more minutes. So you roll over and you go back to sleep. Same thing. It wouldn't be a lot of sleep prior to arriving at Halifax, but it would be better than nothing. He was just trying to squeeze in a few hours here so that they could see about taking care of getting into Halifax and getting that coal and getting on their way. At 3:10 a.m., the Atlantic would have been about 2 miles off the southeast coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. We discussed the location of Halifax in relation to the rest of Nova Scotia in the episode on the Halifax explosion, but just as a reminder, Halifax sits in the middle of the island's southern coast. To get there by ship, one must head up Halifax Harbor just to the east of the lighthouse on Sambro Island, the oldest surviving lighthouse in North America. It is still there. You can still go and see it. But if someone were approaching Halifax directly from the south and a geographical smidge to the left, they would find themselves approaching the Rocky Islands, which make up the area around Lower Prospect. Lower Prospect looks like a place out of a turn-of-the-century novel about an orphaned girl mistakenly taken in by a rural family if that family were fishermen and not farmers. So, yeah, I know that's Prince Edward Island and not Nova Scotia. It's Lucy Maud Montgomery. That was the first thing that came to mind. But that is what I thought of when I saw that. It's basically the fisherman version of Anne of Green Gables. It is a lot of rocky shores and little spread out houses and all of that. At the time, it was simply a smattering of islands with rocky shores exposed to the vagaries of the Atlantic Ocean, with a handful of families spread out here and there. Some were the only families living on their own island, not in a billionaire sort of a way, but in a this is where the fish are way. The rest of the year was for going out onto the ocean to fish, but now they were cozied up in their small homes, their boats packed away for the winter. As those locals slept, the crew of the Atlantic searched through the stormy night for the light from Sambro Island. If they were on the right path, the Sambro Island lighthouse should be up ahead on their left. So that's where they were looking for it, off the port side of the bow. There's just a slight problem. See, Nova Scotia is connected to New Brunswick to the north, but only to the east. To the northwest of Nova Scotia, just to the west of where Nova Scotia and New Brunswick connect, and sitting between the two provinces is the Bay of Fundy. The Bay of Fundy's tidal range is wild, coming in at 16 times the average tidal range around the world. You can tie your boat to the dock at high tide and then come back at low tide and see it over 50 feet lower than it was when you left it. Now, that is a lot of water coming in and going out of the Bay of Fundy as the tides change. About 100 billion tons of water. And with all that water comes some very strong currents. At the time the Atlantic turned north toward Halifax, high tide was drawing near. As it did, the currents along the southern coast of Nova Scotia pushed west, flowing up and around into the Bay of Fundy. So as the ship came closer to the coast, the current nudged the Atlantic slowly but surely to the west toward Lower Prospect. At 10 after 3, Captain Williams should have been standing on the bridge alongside Second Officer Metcalf, drinking his hot chocolate, if there was any left, as they eased the Atlantic to a safe spot near the lighthouse at Sambro Island. But Captain Williams wasn't on the bridge. He was still asleep in his bed. He'd awoken at 2, but did what many of us would have done and rolled back over to go to sleep. When his valet showed up with his hot chocolate, Fourth Officer Brown sent the valet to Metcalf to check if it was okay to wake the captain, because he didn't know anything about this. And Metcalf just kind of waved the valet off. He's like, no, it's fine. Go on. Go. You don't have to worry about this. This is fine. We'll wake him up. Leave the captain be. Let him sleep. He would say basically the same thing 20 minutes later, 3 a.m., people around him, the other officers, kind of going, hey, aren't we supposed to wake the captain? He's like, no, it's fine. We're almost there. We're almost there. We'll tell him when we get there. If it was confidence which drove Metcalf to let the captain sleep, it was definitely false confidence. Metcalf had never led this approach to Halifax. In fact, most of the officers hadn't. One person on the bridge who knew the approach to Halifax was Quartermaster Robert Thomas, who was at the wheel. He felt something wasn't right, and for good reason. They were all looking for Sambro Island just ahead and to the port side. But because of the push of the current, Sambro Island was a good 10 miles or 16 kilometers off to the starboard side of the ship. So it's way off to their right. And it's a hazy night. They may or may not be able to see the light. The point is, they're not going to be able to see it on their left, and that's where they're looking. The Atlantic was pointed directly toward Lower Prospect with its scattered little homes, the occupants fast asleep. There were no city lights to guide its way or warn the ship was off course. The Atlantic's crew weren't going to see the lighthouse if they looked straight ahead or to the left. They were never going to see any lights given the time of day and the position of the ship. It's just this basically empty area, nearly empty area, full of little tiny homes where everybody has gone to bed, and it's not going to be, there's not going to be a lot of light out. It's just going to be the moon, if there is any behind the cloud cover that you can see. Quartermaster Thomas knew the shores near Halifax were low and rocky, and he told Second Officer Metcalf as much. He gave Metcalf a heads up that, hey, I know you think we've still got plenty of time and space to reach the Nova Scotia coastline, but I know from experience that we are more than likely way closer than that. Metcalf shrugged him off, and the ship continued onward at full speed. According to steerage passenger John Holland, who'd taken a stroll on deck just before 1 a.m., he overheard Thomas tell Metcalf that they were quote, too near the land. Metcalf's response to that was that Thomas was, quote, neither a captain or a mate, and that he, quote, knew too much. Holland would later state that he suspected Metcalf was drunk. He testified at the inquiry and said all of this. Now, I'm not sure if Metcalf was drunk or not, but the attitude with him and with Thomas was basically that you're just a quartermaster, you're not an officer, you have no say here. This is my decision, not yours. Second Officer Metcalf had dismissed the valet and didn't bother to have the captain woken up when he'd asked to be, but as the minutes passed, Metcalf started to realize that maybe getting the captain might be a good idea, considering they still couldn't see the lighthouse. Just as he was about to send someone to get Captain Williams at 3:12 a.m., Lookout Joseph Carroll shouted a warning. He could see waves breaking against rocks up ahead, meaning they were treacherously close to the shoreline. At this point, Metcalf ordered the engines to be reversed and that the ship be turned hard to port. The Atlantic ran over rocks under the water like jagged speed bumps, which tore open the keel of the ship like an orange peel. Despite the destruction caused to the Atlantic, the ship kept going toward the rocky shore without getting stuck. Turning the ship was taking too long. I mean, if you know anything about the sinking of the Titanic, you know that they were trying to turn the ship at the time, and it was so big that they just did not have time to get that ship to turn the way that they wanted it to. The Atlantic is kind of in the same position, except that the shoreline is way closer than that iceberg was. With the ship going forward, turning the ship's taking too long, so the Atlantic drove straight toward a large rock sticking out of the water. With the ship essentially running over the equivalent of road construction that has yet to be paved, it soon became apparent to those throughout the ship, no matter what section they might be traveling in, that the Atlantic hit a rough patch. Passengers would later report about 2 or 3 shocks, spaced out by a minute or two each. It felt like you hit a pothole, and then a couple minutes later you hit another pothole, and a couple minutes later you hit another pothole, and it's like, if you're in a car, that's one thing. If you're in a ship, probably not a good thing. At the rear of the ship, the propeller continued to turn. Even though the Atlantic is stuck on this rock, it's still turning. With the Atlantic still in reverse, it might have pulled the ship free of the rock it was stuck on. But the ocean and the wind elbowed the stern toward the shore and directly against a rock ledge in the water. When the propeller struck the ledge, its still spinning fan blades snapped off like daisy petals. With cold seawater now spilling into the ship, it was dangerous to continue using the engines, so the ship's engineers turned the engines off and opened the boiler valves to prevent the water from causing them to blow up. Chief Engineer Finley just kind of shut everything down, and it just evacuated the area. That's it. That's all we're doing. Everybody out. The Atlantic skidded over the rocks before finally running aground at the bow. With the front of the ship propped up on rocks and the keel torn open, the water inside the Atlantic followed gravity down into the stern. It was sitting at an angle, but it wasn't sitting at like that really, really steep angle that you see Titanic having at the beginning, at the end of the movie when it's sinking. It's not that steep. It is like when you drive off the road accidentally and you end up going over a curb or over a bump and the front of your car is up a little bit, and so the back of your car goes down. It's like that. The water inside the Atlantic followed gravity down into the stern, where the single women who were in steerage were sleeping. If any of them were still sleeping after all the commotion, it may have been a blessing. Every woman within that section of the ship drowned within minutes. This left the only female survivors as the married women and the girls in the married steerage section. By now, Captain Williams was awake and had rushed to the deck, taking a quick assessment of their precarious situation. You have to imagine what he's thinking right now. He had planned, I take a nap, I get up at like 2:40, I have a hot chocolate, I smoke a cigar, I relax a little bit, and then I go up and we get this ship exactly where it's supposed to go. And now, all of a sudden, this ship is clearly in distress, to say the very least. He went through a quick checklist of the tasks the crew would need to do to abandon the Atlantic. You get the lifeboats swung out and prepared, get all the passengers up on deck, and bring out the distress rockets. We have to do all of the things that you're supposed to do in an emergency. Let's just get that done. Two of the quartermasters, Quartermaster Roylance and Quartermaster Speakman, made quick work of firing off one distress rocket after another. Just bang, 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 constantly. The hope was that someone on land would spot the rockets and come help. It was a long shot, especially considering Mars Island only had one family living there, the Clancys. Now, if you look at a map of this island, if you look it up on Google Maps or Apple Maps, you will see this island, and it's kind of a rocky island. It's shaped a little bit like Great Britain, that kind of side, the English, England, Wales, Scotland, that side, that part of Great Britain, it is kind of shaped like that. Now, that narrow part in the middle, the Atlantic is up on rocks on that left side of the narrow part. The Clancys live in a home on the left side, on the eastern side of the island. So they're on the other side of this island, but not so far away that it is a huge effort to get over to where this is happening. It's happening relatively close, just on the other side of the island. But the rockets and commotion would soon wake Patriarch Michael Clancy, who dressed quickly and headed out to see what he could do. I'll get more into what was happening there in a bit, but I kind of just want to focus on the sinking right now. Now, at this point, the Atlantic sat parallel to the eastern coast of the western coast of the island, with the land off to the starboard side. Those rough waves, which warned the crew they were about to crash into the rocks, now splashed over the decks, making them slick and slippery. Remember, the stern is down, so the water is like washing up the decks down there, and then the bow is kind of tilted because it's propped up on this rock, so water's splashing up on there. There's just water everywhere. And here you are, you're trying to get up onto this deck, and it is just, the passengers, the crew are all slipping and sliding around. Many of those passengers who climbed up onto the deck to escape the flooding and try to access the lifeboats found themselves being swept away into the freezing ocean waters. Children didn't stand much of a chance, and the still surviving women weren't much better off. So a lot of them were getting up there and then just immediately being washed off into the sea. Any man determined to keep his family together could find himself being washed off the deck as he tried to save his wife and kids. If you were completely selfish and you didn't care about your family at all and you just focused on yourself, a man could definitely stay on that ship. if he wanted to. I say definitely. I really don't think making any guarantees here is probably a good thing. But in terms of how do you have a better chance? It's not having a family that you need to watch out for, not having, your grandmother and your kids and your wife and your sister and all of this. If you didn't have to worry about them and you only had to worry about yourself as a man, that heightened your ability to survive what was going on. The sensible thing at this point, with the Atlantic beached on the rocks and the waves splashing across the decks, would be to load the 9 remaining lifeboats and try to save as many people as possible. Remember, one of those lifeboats got destroyed in a storm on the way across the Atlantic, so they only have 9 now. Note that I didn't say save everybody on board, because much like with Titanic, the Atlantic would also not carry sufficient lifeboats for all of those on board. Atlantic's lifeboats fulfilled the requirements of contemporary maritime law, which measured lifeboat space by actual literal space. You needed to have a specific amount of cubic feet in the lifeboats, and even then, that didn't mean the lifeboats would fit everyone on the ship. According to the law, Atlantic's lifeboats needed 3,600 cubic feet of lifeboat, but those 10 lifeboats contained an additional 2,178 cubic feet of space. Even under the best of conditions, a sunny day, a calm sea, all of the lifeboats still there. Atlantic's lifeboats could hold at most 600 people. Under worse conditions, like say in the middle of the night in rough late winter seas with one of the lifeboats not even there anymore, the lifeboats might be able to save 400 people. And remember, like I said, Lifeboat 4 had been smashed to pieces days earlier by the rough seas, so now that's even fewer people they could carry. Losing the rest of those on board the ship was, to paraphrase a current American vice presidential candidate, just a fact of life you'd have to accept as you waved at the last lifeboat from the deck of the ship that was sinking underneath you. Members of the ship loaded the boats nearest the Atlantic's single funnel and then attempted to lower them. But each one smashed against the hull and lost all of those on board almost as soon as their hulls touched the rough waves. The sea had no intention of letting anyone get off the ship alive, at least not the conventional way. They tried this a couple of times. They didn't get all of the lifeboats to go down because only one side was really... It was really easy to get them off on that side. Easier, I guess, but it was still difficult. Either side, you cannot get these lifeboats down. Their waves are smashing, and the it's windy and things are just awful, and the way everything is going, these lifeboats could not be lowered. As soon as several lifeboats met the same grisly fate, Captain Williams immediately ordered the lowering of lifeboats to halt. But far be it from Second Officer Metcalf not to fulfill his role as a disaster movie villain. He had already gotten into one lifeboat laden with people, one which he had been assigned to. This wasn't a J. Bruce's May thing. He didn't just get in. He was supposed to be in this lifeboat. Even though the captain said not to lower the lifeboat, Metcalf's headed down toward the sea. Now, depending on the source you look at, either he had already started lowering down toward the sea, and then the captain came over and said, stop lowering the lifeboat, and he kept going anyway. Or he hadn't even started lowering, and the captain said, don't lower the lifeboats, and Metcalf's response was essentially, we're going. And so he went. But just as with the others, this lifeboat ended up a handful of broken wood and bodies scattered across the waves. And that was the end of Second Officer Metcalf. The 2 quartermasters who'd been setting off distress rockets, Roylance and Speakman, that they'd been setting off since everything had gone to hell, were about to set off their 9th rocket when the explosive failed. It went off in their hands as they prepared it, leaving the 2 men injured. It kind of burned their hands, burned their faces. Not too terribly, as I understand it, but enough to be a distraction. The other rockets they had at that point were just left to roll away in all of the chaos, and they rolled right off the ship. So there was no more rockets to be had. While all of this was going on, those still below decks were trying to reach the relative safety of the outer decks with little success. There were 2 stairwells down into the ship, and both had cascading waterfalls of the invading ocean pouring down them. The lights were out, the other passengers were panicking. It was sheer luck that anyone made it up on deck. You kind of have to imagine, it's like when you're a kid and you're climbing, you're trying to climb the slide at the park, except this time it's a water slide, and also it's falling out from under you, and it's a terrible thing to try and get up these steps, and it's a miracle if you can pull it off. Captain Williams directed everyone to head toward the bow of the ship, which was still stuck on the rock that it had struck. It's still up there, but it is the safest. It's farthest away from the water, but it's not going to stay that way for long. The stern, on the other hand, was floating freely and moving all over with every pass of the waves. Getting to that safer area on the bow was like trying to climb that slide. That slide that normally is it's difficult, but you can get up it. But now there's water flowing down it, and it's moving back and forth, and you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to pull it off. It's a lot easier just to go up the ladder. But there is no ladder. This is your only option. It was about this time that the Atlantic shifted its position on the rocks. It rolled toward port, the stern sinking below the water, and the bow slipping slightly off the rock. Anyone who'd made it up to the dock and couldn't grab onto something fell into the ocean. Captain Williams and other officers ordered everyone on deck to begin climbing the rigging of the sails if they could. Any of the seamen aboard could easily do this. This is something you were supposed to be able to do as part of your job, and so they would have been able to just climb the rigging no problem. But asking a regular person to scale the masts of a ship sinking, that is sitting at an angle, it's sinking, crashing waves are washing over the dock, the wind is blowing, like it is the worst. It's a desperate demand when there are simply no other options. Among those who climbed the mast to get to safety was Rosa Bateman. Now, Rosa Bateman traveled aboard the Atlantic with her husband and child, who may have been one of the 2 infants born aboard the vessel, depending on the source. It doesn't seem like anybody's really sure about whether or not the kid was born on the ship, but it was a baby, and it was her and her husband and this baby. Whatever the child's birthplace, the couple and their baby somehow managed to make their way up to on deck. The family readied themselves to climb the rigging up to the mizzenmast, which is the third one back from the front, only for the baby to be swept out of Mr. Bateman's arms by a strong wave. With no time to mourn, the Batemans attempted to scale the mizzenmast. Like I said, the third back from the bow. The foremast is up front, and then there's another one, and then there's the mizzenmast. Mr. Bateman soon followed the captain's instructions to move forward up into the fore rigging near the bow, but Rosa was too tired to move at this point. She's exhausted. She's wearing a nightdress. She's in this long white gown. She's tired. Her baby just got washed over the shore. She's not getting down from the mizzenmast. She's staying right where she is. Officer John Firth, who was there, helped tie her to the mizzenmast so she wouldn't lose her grip and fall onto the deck or into the sea. Secured to the mast in only her nightgown in the rain and the cold, Rosa Bateman remained the only woman on the Atlantic still alive, although that didn't last. Swimming to the land, it wasn't really a viable option, zapping the strength of even the strongest swimmers who tried. There were people who did successfully make it to shore, but not a lot of them. Several crew members attempted to get down onto the rock the bow grounded on. So this rock, which was supposedly, you'll see in some sources, it referred to as, I think, Good Luck Rock. That is not the rock in question. Good Luck Rock is down at the bottom of the island of Mars Island, and it's a completely different rock. Anyway, they want to get down onto this rock. It is land. It is much safer than being on this ship that's rolling all over the place and all of that. So a rope was tied around each man's waist, willing to try to reach the rock. Once someone finally did get down to that rock, they secured the rope, and one after another, men climbed down the rope to the rock, dangling like sloths as they did so. So you know the kind of climbing that I'm talking about, where you have your hands up on top and your legs kind of clenching, and you're just hanging, dangling down, and it's that kind of a thing. There were several members of the crew who tried to get that rope down to the rock, and I'm not exactly sure how they secured it. Can't remember at the moment, but the fact remains that it took them a couple of tries. All of this, every single thing that they tried, was very difficult. Mother Nature was not making this rescue easy. Hours were passing as the locals who came to help tried to figure out how to help those still on the ship and those on the rock itself. With the changing of the tides, standing on an already slippery rock in the wind was made even more difficult, as the space on that rock became a hot commodity. Now keep in mind, you're getting high tide twice a day. They are standing there for hours. So they're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. There's only so long they can be there. Those who came from the shore, from land, used their boats to grab whomever they could off the rock and off the sinking Atlantic. But those who'd climbed into the rigging found themselves in a precarious position. Those in the masts further back either attempted to climb back down or to swing from one mast to the other on the rigging. They weren't always successful and fell into the sea along with so many others. As the hours passed, only 3 people were still left in the rigging. Officer Firth, Rosa Bateman, and another man named Charles Flanley. He was passenger. And Rosa Bateman was fading fast. She was really not looking well. Enter the Reverend William Ancient. The name gives the mental image of an elderly man with a notched collar and a long white beard who tripped and fell out of a fantasy novel. Or a horror novel. It sounds like something out of a Mike Flanagan show. Anyway, the Reverend Ancient was only 39 years old, looking a bit in his portrait like an Amish Ron Weasley. He'd missed the earlier rush to rescue. He hadn't woken up when everybody else I think he was in Upper Prospect, Lower Prospect. He was in one of them, and he wakes up that morning. It's like 6, 7 a.m., whenever it was. He's supposed to have breakfast with another person in town, and they don't show up. So now he's like, where is everybody? So he goes out and he starts looking, and everybody in town is gone, and he has no idea why. He realized where everybody was when he looks over at where all of this is going on and sees the chaos of this ship that is sinking and boats that are going towards, and he's like, okay, I gotta go over there. By the time he made it over to the wreck site in his boat, it was early afternoon on April 1st. So remember, this ship grounded at like 3:10 in the morning. This is early afternoon, and there are still people on the rock, on the boat, all of that. Seeing exhausted rescuers and several people still alive in the rigging of the Atlantic, Reverend Ancient demanded some of the men get up and come help him recover Officer Firth and Charles Flanley. At that point, it was very obvious that Rosa Bateman had passed away. She's very pale. She's just dangling there. She was foaming at the mouth, so she was gone. But Officer Firth and Charles Flanley, at the point that William Ancient gets there, they're the last 2 people there. Now, remember, he's gotten there after everybody else, and everybody else has been rescuing people for hours. They are exhausted, and they are looking at Officer Firth and Charles Flanley and thinking, you guys stay there. We need like 5 minutes to catch our breath. We need to warm up, all of that. We just need a minute. And William Ancient strides up, who, he hasn't had any sort of exhaustion the way these people have, and he's like, no, get up, come on, we're going to get him. So it had been clear before the Reverend and his makeshift crew even reached the Atlantic that there were no longer any female survivors of the wreck. Rosa Bateman, who had been tied to the mizzenmast by Officer Firth to save her life, could be seen from the shore hanging limp from the rigging, having passed away from hypothermia. But the other 2 men were recovered. Flanley leapt from the rigging with a life vest and jumped into the water near Reverend Ancient's boat, where he was pulled in. I believe he hurt himself a little bit, but he was brought in and he was okay. But since Firth couldn't swim, Ancient scrambled onto the wreck like a monkey and threw a lifeline to Firth. He basically like climbs all over this thing, like using like the railings and all of that, like ladders, and gets over there and gets that lifeline to Firth. Now, despite a fall which would break both his legs, Officer John Firth would be the last person removed alive from the Atlantic. Over 535 people would perish when the SS Atlantic sank just off the coast of Nova Scotia on April 1st, 1873. The disaster would be the deadliest to happen in Nova Scotia until the Halifax explosion 4 decades later. The loss of the Atlantic would also be the deadliest shipwreck in the North Atlantic for nearly 40 years, until another White Star Line vessel on its maiden voyage would strike an iceberg one cold April night in 1912 and sink to the bottom of the sea, taking around 1,500 people with her. Due to the circumstances of the ship's sinking, all of the survivors, save for one, were adult men. Out of the 345 women and children on board the Atlantic, only 14-year-old John Hindley lived through the disaster. Hindley, who'd lost his family in the sinking, became a sort of mascot, with people bending over backwards to throw money at him, get him new clothes, take a fine portrait of him for the papers so everybody can say, hey, look, here's this survivor, and yeah, offers to adopt him just like poured in. People were like, oh, the poor orphan, he needs a family. But the thing is, he and his family were traveling to America because they already had family here. He actually had two older sisters in America, and he would end up going to live with his sister and her husband when all was said and done. The main reason for those who survived was the assistance of a handful of people who spotted the flares from the sinking ship and raced to help. The fishing communities near where the Atlantic tore through its keel in the middle of the night that April 1st were hardworking, but not even close to wealthy. Homes were small, siblings and relatives shared beds, and food stores needed to last through the winter until the weather improved enough for the fishing to start back up again. It was a hard life, and in many cases a lonely one. The islands in the area often only had 1 or 2 small cottages dotting their surfaces, 2 or 3 room clapboard homes weathered over time by the sea. Nowadays, they might look like cute little Airbnbs that you would stay in to right by the sea, like someone out of a Nicholas Sparks novel, but back then, this was the house you and your mom and dad and your 8 siblings crammed into for the winter to live. That's what you lived in. It was a very small, uncomfortable space that you're cramming yourself into, and that is what you would see on the opposite side of the island from where the Atlantic grounded, which is just one little cottage. Mars Island only had one residence at the time, that of the Clancy family. Michael Clancy, his daughter Sarah Jane O'Reilly, and 9 other members of the family crowded together into a cottage, which might pop up on a tiny house Facebook page after a lot of work. It could probably work out great in this day and age as an Airbnb, as a writer's cabin, like I said, but in 1873, the Clancy home wasn't nearly big enough to comfortably fit every member of the family. It was a glorified shed. That's what it was. It managed the very low bar of keeping the family warm and dry during the rough weather near the shore. And even then, warm and dry was pushing it. Michael Clancy awoke in the middle of the night to the loud sound of hissing and crashing. He heard probably like the air being expelled out of the funnel, the steam, I should say. Curious, he got out of bed and he looked out the window and he spotted the rockets going up in the air. So at this point, he dresses warmly, he ventures outside in the harsh weather, the harsh night, to investigate that hissing sound, taking his brother and his teenage son, his 16-year-old son, with him. Meanwhile, over in the town of Upper Prospect to the west, Tommy Coolin had a clear line of sight to the foundering vessel and the rockets being fired from the deck. He went and told his brother there was a ship sinking over by Mars Island. Slight problem, it's April 1st, and unsurprisingly, Tommy's brother thought he was pulling his leg. In reality, Tommy was trying to pull the entirety of him to get him to go see for himself what was happening so very close to them. Once he was satisfied, the two men began to gather as many men as they could to row over and help out. Something you should need to keep in mind about this rescue attempt was that the fishing season had not yet begun in this area of Nova Scotia, and therefore everyone's boats were packed away for the winter. Rescuers needed to remove their boats from storage, make sure they were still okay after their winter hibernation. You don't know, maybe there's a hole in it, maybe there's, something that needs to be repaired that you can't use it right now. You really need to make sure that this boat is going to be okay because you have to go out and save people in it. And so they're getting these boats out of winter hibernation, and then they're going to head out toward the Atlantic. Back on Mars Island, the Clancy men had arrived on the scene of the disaster in awe of the chaos and destruction taking place so close to their home. Just imagine you take a wrong turn, you walk out of your house and you walk down the street or around the corner and you see just something absolutely terrible or horrific, something you would never imagine right in front of you. Standing there on the shore when they arrived was Quartermaster Thomas, who'd somehow made it off the ship and down onto the rock, then all the way across through the waves and up the rocks onto land. Thomas explained the whole situation to the men, who directed him to where their home was so that he could go there and get warm and dry. What happened next was the boat version of the telephone game. The Clancys sent a kid in a dinghy to the next island over, up to Lower Prospect, and he contacted the family there that was on the next island, and then it went up to Lower Prospect, and then it went up to Terrence Bay, which is above that. Like, they were, passing these notes up to more and more people. And every time this message would get passed on, more people would come to try and help. Third Officer Brady made it to shore and stated he needed to send a message by telegram to the White Star Line. So that was, they were trying to deal with that. They're trying to get the postman up so they can see about getting that taken care of. Those from Lower Prospect who arrived in a fishing boat needed to be very careful in their approach and couldn't do so from the sea. You couldn't do that on the western side of the island. So what they had to do was they had to go over and land near the Clancy home on the opposite side of the island, pick up the boat out of the water, and then carry it over to the disaster site. At that point, it was a matter of grabbing whomever they could when they get in the boat and they get in the water. It's just, whoever you see, get them. Just throw them in the boat. You're on the rock, get them. And the easiest people to retrieve were those on the rock. There are people standing right there. You basically just pull up and get them in and get them off as soon as possible. Now, from the bow of the ship, Captain Williams called out to those attempting to rescue survivors, hoping to get them to stop saving those on the relatively safe rock and help get people off the ship itself, which would slide into the water at any moment. It was bound to go under, and they really needed somebody to come help them. Desperate to get their help, Captain Williams screamed out an offer of $500 for every boatload of survivors the rescuers recovered from the ship. Now, the documentary said that they weren't sure whether it was pounds or dollars, but the point is that that's about $10,000 today, either way. So offering that to poor fishermen who crammed into tiny cottages year-round with their large families, that was dangling a pretty big carrot over a rabbit. They start going and they get other fishing boats. They're carrying it across the island so the recovery of those aboard the breaking ship can begin. Because it really is starting to break. It just, all of the things that it's going through, it's been hours. It's starting to snap in the middle. So things are going worse and worse with every passing moment. After getting off the ship and onto the safe, solid ground of the land, the closest place to go, of course, was Michael Clancy's home, just to the east on the island. There, Clancy's daughter, Sarah Jane Riley, or I think it might be O'Reilly, but Sarah Jane took over the care of the bedraggled survivors who stumbled in the door. The Clancys only had so much food left in their winter storage, but out it came in an effort to feed and warm the exhausted men who made their way to the home. It was just this line of men, and it was basically like you have to imagine there must have been like a bouncer at the door saying like, well, we've, like, hold on. We've got like 8 people in here right now. Let's warm them and get them dry. And then you 3 people can come in, like it's that kind of a thing where it was basically you give them what you can, you warm them up, and then you send them off to another home where they can rest or, somewhere where they don't have to get kicked out after 5 minutes. Inside the Clancy home, only so many survivors could fit. It turned into a procession. You go inside the Clancy home, you warm up and dry off a little, get a little food in your belly, and then head back out again for other survivors to get their own simple needs met. Once you were that little bit improved, you'd be taken by boat to another nearby island or to the mainland where local families would put you up until you felt well enough to move on. It felt as though every single home in the surrounding area had at least one soaking wet, freezing cold man taking a much-needed rest in one of their few beds. It didn't take long for the procession of soaking, chilled survivors to have an effect on the interior of the Clancy home. At some point, the inside of the cabin was ankle-deep in cold seawater, which had dripped off the survivors' clothes. To empty it out, holes were simply drilled into the floor of the home, and the water just sort of flowed right out that way. It was the easiest way to do it. The help the families of the Lower Prospect region provided asked a great deal from humble people only too willing to hand over what little food stores they had left. The food meant to last them through the winter was now desperately needed by men who'd spent hours standing in the stormy cold on that particular rock or clinging to the rigging of the Atlantic's masts. But whatever the survivors needed, local families handed them without a second thought. And now, keep in mind also, they were doing this. Some of them may have thought that later on they were going to get that $500 that Captain Williams promised for everybody who was taken off the ship. Then that money never appeared. Nobody ever gave them that $500, which is completely unsurprising, but still. And then there was Officer Brady. After getting off the ship, one would think he'd go get dried off and fed, but Brady was too focused on the rescue. He went back and forth with the locals picking up survivors, at least once going close to the ship so he could speak with the captain. They're like yelling back and forth, and like he is still there. I don't know if he just had endless energy or if he was going to drop like a rock the minute he had a moment to himself. He then decided that he needed to walk to Halifax. Someone needed to make sure the White Star Line knew what had happened and organize the response, and there was a White Star Line office as far as I recall, in Halifax. There's this office for the White Star Line. So he's got to get there. Now, if you check Apple Maps today, it would take 10 hours to walk from Lower Prospect to Halifax. But not only would Officer Brady have been exhausted from his exertions, part of the path between Lower Prospect and Halifax was under a foot of snow. Officer Brady was simply the first as well. As soon as the survivors were well enough, they too started the long trek to Halifax. It seems like a lot of people walked their way there instead of getting rides or things like that. I'm not sure how many of them were getting rides, but a lot of people were just walking their way there, and that's tough. One can only imagine how tired the survivors must have been after getting off a sinking ship in the freezing cold, only to spend another day traveling to the nearest city, many of them hiking through foot-deep snow. Understandably, those who'd who'd survived the wreck were all too eager to leave Halifax. However, an inquiry would need to be held, and passengers and crew from the Atlantic needed to stay in Halifax for as long as an inquiry could take. The inquiry would find Captain Williams culpable, but also applauded his response following the wreck as he tried to get as many people off the Atlantic alive as he possibly could. Finding him culpable was, I think, something that they had to do because they had to find somebody culpable. And Captain Williams was in charge. You point the finger at him. But he wasn't on the bridge when this happened. And so I think the more important thing here is his response after he got there. And he was doing everything right as far as he knew when he got to the bridge. Still, Captain Williams had his certificate taken away for 2 years, although not permanently. Captain Williams was incredibly remorseful about what happened at the Atlantic, and almost and about all of the lives lost. If he lost his certificate permanently, he sounds as though he would have been disappointed, but accepting of the loss. He really did feel a great deal of remorse and regret about the ship sinking and all of those lives being lost. As for the person who was actually in charge at the time of the wreck, the inquiry could hardly do much to punish Henry Ismay Metcalfe for mistakes and bad decisions made prior to the ship's sinking. Metcalfe didn't check the depth as he should have done, which the inquiry found to be, quote, the most costly error of all, according to Atlantic's last stop. Metcalfe died in the wreck, so they could hardly take away his certificate as well. Williams stated at the inquiry that he wouldn't have put Metcalfe in charge if he wouldn't have thought Metcalfe could handle the ship. And while others testified about Metcalfe's terrible leadership in those final moments, the inquiry seemingly only cared to hear from Captain Williams and other senior officers. It was another round of, you're just the quartermaster, what do you know? Like that kind of a thing. If you've never heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's basically the opposite of imposter syndrome. Instead of being talented and experienced enough to do something like, say, write a book, yet feeling as though you're not good enough and sooner or later everyone will notice, with the Dunning-Kruger effect, someone who's arguably incompetent to complete their job is incredibly sure of their ability to do it. Metcalfe was positive he could handle this approach to Nova Scotia without disturbing the captain. And why wouldn't he? His professional life consisted of multiple missteps, which might have forced any other ship's mate to look for work in some other arena, like starting a pickle store or joining the circus. But Henry Metcalfe was Henry Ismay Metcalfe, and that made all the difference. And then there was the coal load. The fact is that there was no reason whatsoever that the Atlantic needed to head to Halifax to refuel. Back before they started their journey, the crew of the Atlantic loaded around 850 tons onto the ship in addition to the amount left over from the previous trip, totaling 967 tons. That much coal should have easily gotten the Atlantic to Jersey City even after such a rough ride. Captain Williams could have gone down himself to check the amount of coal available if it weren't for an injury he'd gotten just prior to this particular trip. He served as second officer on the Republic the previous year when the ship sailed through a terrible storm, and while securing the decks, Williams was caught between a railing and a lifeboat swinging wildly from its davit. He broke his leg, some ribs, and dislocated an ankle. After a few months in the hospital, he was mobile, but making his way down to the coal bunkers was still a struggle. So he could have gone down himself to check and make sure that the numbers that he was being given were correct, but he was disabled at the time, and so that really was something that he should have been able to depend on Chief Engineer Finley to provide him with the correct information, and he just was not. The Reverend William Ancient got a lot of public support following the sinking for his push to rescue the final two survivors, Officer John Firth and Charles Flanley. But even he tried to point out that he'd only gotten there in time to save two people. Those on Mars Island in Lower Prospect and Upper Prospect and Terrence Bay, they had helped save hundreds. Reverend Ancient was hard not to notice amongst the other rescuers, a young preacher with a badass name who strode in where others feared to tread. But so many other people in that area put their lives on the line to extract as many survivors as they could from the wreckage of the Atlantic, and their descendants, still living in the area, have a great deal to be proud of. The broken remnants of the SS Atlantic still sit underneath the ocean waters where it sank off the south coast of Nova Scotia, about 2 kilometers to the south. There's no walking or swimming to the site. If you'd like to go, you must take a boat to the spot just off Mars Island. A small number of people have died to the site over the years, recovering artifacts which made their way into the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. It's as far as I understand it, diving to the wreck is really kind of difficult because, I mean, coming up out of the water, there's rocks right there, and you have to make sure that you're not like being banged against the rocks or you'll get hurt. There you have to secure the boat that you're using to ride over there to the shaft, the drive shaft. And I mean, that's kind of sticking out. There's so much stuff down there. And of course, with everything that is going on in that particular part of the ocean, there is just a lot of, it's taking a battering. The wreckage is taking a battering, and it's been falling apart for years. There are also other items from the ship on display at the SS Atlantic Heritage Park and Interpretation Center, a small building in Terrence Bay. These items include dishes and cups, pieces of the ship itself like rusted railings and the clock from the chart room, and personal items left behind by the victims. Near the Memorial Center is the mass grave where the Protestant victims of the disaster were buried, within sight of the Atlantic Ocean waters in which they lost their lives. The grave contains 277 of the Atlantic's victims, with the service held by a Reverend Ancient. The Star of the Sea Cemetery, not far away, holds the graves of 150 Catholic victims. Now, I've seen in other places where the number of Catholic victims is higher than that, or, different numbers, but 150 seems to be the one to go with. So, within walking distance of the center as well is the spot where the Church of Reverend Ancient, Old St. Paul's Church, once stood. I believe it burned down in the 60s, if I'm remembering correctly. Even 150 years later, the memories of those lost on the SS Atlantic have left an indelible mark on this area of Nova Scotia that the locals do an outstanding job of holding up. I cannot imagine... Drink time. I cannot imagine, you wake up and you look out the window and you see this terrible thing happening. I've been seeing all the videos that are coming out of North Carolina and South Carolina and all these other places, Tennessee, where Hurricane Helene is washing away entire towns. And at least in the case of the Atlantic, I mean, if you live by the sea, you're going to see ships. And inevitably, you're probably going to see one sink. It is really difficult to imagine that you would be hundreds of miles inland and be hit by a hurricane that causes such terrible flooding that entire towns are washed away. That is, if you're not from America and you're not exactly sure about the locations that we're talking about, this is not like, Miami expects to be hit by hurricanes like this, along the shoreline, cities along the shoreline, like Charleston, like things like that, they expect, if a hurricane is coming in our direction, we're going to be hit bad. Like, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee does not expect to be hit bad by a hurricane. Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, for those of you who don't know, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee is the home of Dollywood, Dolly Parton's amusement park. And as far as I know, I don't know if the whole thing is like destroyed, but I know that area was the area where a lot of destruction happened nearby. So I don't know how Dollywood looks right now. I just know that there are a lot of people who have lost everything. And last I saw, there were 100 people who'd passed away because of the flooding. It's horrifying. Seeing these pictures is horrifying because, this is not where hurricanes are supposed to go. It made me think of Hurricane Agnes. And if you didn't listen to that episode and you're not sure, Hurricane Agnes, what's that? Hurricane Agnes was a hurricane which hit the area where I live back in 72, I believe. 72 or 73. I want to say 72. But the thing is that we are about 90 miles or so away from the ocean. So we're usually far enough inland that the worst we get is maybe some bad thunderstorms if a hurricane passes by. When Hurricane Agnes came up this way in 72, the flooding was so bad that Binghamton, not Binghamton. Binghamton. It was Binghamton, Elmira, Corning, Wilkes-Barre, all of these towns that I've been to. I've been to all of these towns, and they were underwater. There was so much flooding. There were floodplains that people were living on, and they knew there were floodplains, and they lived there anyway. But in the case of the people who are being affected now, a lot of them were in places where this sort of thing doesn't happen. And so there's always an urge when things like Hurricane Helene happen where people are like, you're supposed to evacuate. It's a mandatory evacuation. Why don't you evacuate? And the problem is that you can't just evacuate. A lot of people cannot just evacuate. There are, you have sick relatives, or you have a job that won't let you go, which, yay, late stage capitalism. Or you have animals you can't bring with you that you don't want to leave, or you have, you don't have the money to go. Going places costs money. And, if you want to leave, maybe you don't have a car. It's something as simple as that. And yes, of course, they may provide a ride, but they may not be able to provide enough rides for everybody to get out of there before the storm hits. And so there is just a lot of people that you see in comments online doing a lot of victim blaming of, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go? And I don't think that's the question. The question isn't, why didn't you go? Why did you stay? You knew this was coming. This could happen. What are you doing? And I think the question is more along the lines of, what are we going to do? Those of us who are in a safe location, what are we going to do? We need to do something, and we need to help people. We need to help these people. We need to help as much as we can. Sitting around and questioning the why and the what and the wherefore, that is not going to do anything to help anyone. But saying, okay, we're going to send in people to rebuild your homes. We're going to provide you with, with grants so you can get food and money and all the things that you need to take care of yourself and your family. Like, we need to be working on that. So I would probably say donate to the Red Cross, but that is kind of reflex because it is the first name that pops into everybody's head. I would probably say to double check and look around and do a little research before you donate to a program that is going to be helping the people who are living through the effects of Hurricane Helene. Just kind of double check and make sure that they're legit. They're going to get that money to them. They are not going to it's not going to be any sort of proselytizing or trying to convert people or anything like that. There are plenty of charities that are willing to help that aren't going to try and, make you join their church before you get anything from them, which is just manipulative and wrong. But I would just really suggest, if you can, just helping out in whatever way, shape, or form. If you got $5 that you can spare, please help the people in Tennessee and North Carolina and South Carolina and Atlanta also had like some sort of explosion that I didn't even get a chance to look up because I was too busy writing these scripts. So there's a lot going on right now in the eastern United States, and knock on wood, nothing will happen up here in the north, because I think if everything on the East Coast is a mess, then I don't know what we're gonna do. So yeah. Anyway, it was my birthday yesterday. I figured I would throw that out there. If anybody, wants to throw a few bucks my way or get me anything, my wish list is on my Tumblr account. My PayPal and stuff is all at the front of the episode. I'm very broke, so you can do that. I got a gift card to put gas in my car. So everybody I know has no money, so that's okay. I'm grateful for anything I can get, but I also my work at the dog camp a has a system where we can, when your birthday comes around, you can pick from a website a present from there. And I'm finally getting a rice cooker, so that's good. I get to order a rice cooker for free. Yay. I am 47 years old now, and I am still trying to wrap my brain around it. But I think the best thing I will say that I got for my birthday was I took the night of my birthday off, but the night before, excuse me, I still had to go to my night job, and I only had 3 hours to spare of vacation time, so I left at 3 o'clock, which meant that from 12 until 3, I was still working on my birthday. Well, the area of the factory that I work in, there's a large group of Indian immigrants who work in that area. We're all friends. We're so great. They're so nice. They're always sharing their food with me. Because they know that I'm willing to try new stuff, and they're like, oh, here, try this and try that, and oh, let me try some of that, and we switch around all the time. They're always trying to get me to eat healthier. It's like my mom and dad. It's like having an extra mom and dad, except they speak Gujarati and I don't. So the thing is that at midnight, when it was my birthday, the guy who works closest with me, said, oh, hey, it's 12 o'clock, so it's your birthday. He said it very loudly. And almost immediately, every single one of the Indian workers hurried over to our section, and I saw that they were coming, and I just kind of jokingly pretended I was going to run away. But they all very kindly came over, and they were shaking my hand and saying, a happy birthday, many blessings. I hope you have, good luck, have a good year, all this really kind, wonderful stuff. And it was just every single one of them. And it was such a nice, warm thing. And by the end, I really needed that. It made my heart happy. So, Professor's not here. He's at camp. If anybody's wondering, he didn't get me anything. That lousy little punk. He needs a job. Why doesn't he have a job so he can get his mom presents? Because I got 2 presents and a bunch of people saying very nice things to me, and I'm perfectly happy with those. But also, where is my present from my son? Where is it? I want it. My son needs to get me a present, and unfortunately I don't have any money to buy something and pretend like he got me something, so it sucks all around. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this. I'm actually ready to record the next episode, and so I'm going to finish what I'm doing right now and move on to episode number 2 of the recording tonight. Woohoo! It's not the same disaster. It's some completely different disaster. But I'm all finished, and I'm so proud of myself. Yay! Thanks, everybody. And wherever you are, if you are in the path of Hurricane Helene, if you are somewhere where things are really, trouble right now, just please stay safe.